You can't prove a thing, she shrieked, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the flimsy lectern. This is a conspiracy. I just stood there, my hands in my pockets, and let the silence hang in the air for a moment. Ma'am, I said, my voice calm and even, a stark contrast to her screeching. The soil samples, the forged invoices, and the high-definition video of you poisoning my lawn aren't a conspiracy. They're called evidence. That was the moment the whole house of cards didn't just collapse, it was atomized. It was the culmination of a war I never wanted to fight, a war that started over something beautiful and ended with the complete and utter destruction of a petty tyrant. It started with my wife's bees. My name is Mark, and for the last 30 years, I've been a civil engineer. I specialize in hydrology and soil mechanics, which sounds terribly boring, and mostly, it is. I design drainage systems, analyze erosion patterns, and tell developers that no, you can't build a condominium complex on what is essentially a subterranean swamp. It's a profession built on patience, precision, and an intimate understanding of how things fall apart under pressure. I had no idea how useful that would become. A year before this whole mess began, I lost my wife, Eleanor. Her battle with cancer was short and brutal, and when it was over, the silence in our house was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. We'd built this life together, this home in the quiet, manicured suburb of Oakwood Estates. After she was gone, I was just a ghost rattling around in a museum of our memories. My only real solace was in the backyard. That was Eleanor's domain. She had a green thumb that was nothing short of magical, but her real passion, her final project, was her bees. She'd taken up beekeeping a few years prior, becoming a devoted apiarist. She loved those little creatures, the way they worked together, the intricate society humming away in the two pristine white hives she kept near the back fence. They're the lifeblood of this whole neighborhood, Mark, she used to say, holding up a frame buzzing with activity. They ask for nothing and give everything. After she passed, I inherited her little flock. I didn't have her natural touch, but I had my engineer's mind. I learned everything I could, reading books, watching videos, and applying a methodical approach to their care. Tending to the hives became my ritual, my therapy. The low, steady hum was a comfort, a living sound in a world that had gone quiet. It was my last, tangible connection to her. Our neighborhood, Oakwood Estates, looked like it was pulled straight from a brochure for suburban bliss. Perfectly trimmed lawns, identical mailboxes, and a sense of enforced serenity that always felt a bit fragile. The source of this fragility, the tiny crack in the idyllic facade, was our homeowners association. And the self-appointed guardian of that facade was Brenda. Brenda was the HOA president, a title she wore like a monarch's crown. She was a woman in her late 50s with a helmet of blonde hair that looked like it could deflect small arms fire and a voice that could curdle milk from 50 paces. She patrolled the streets in a golf cart she'd customized with the HOA logo, her eyes scanning for infractions with the predatory focus of a hawk. A garbage can left out an hour too long, a garden gnome deemed tacky, a basketball hoop that wasn't the approved shade of black, no detail was too small for a righteous fury. Most people just put up with her. It was easier to pay the ridiculous fine or move the offending lawn ornament than to engage. I was one of them. For the first year after Eleanor died, I was invisible, a grieving widower who kept to himself and paid his dues on time. I just wanted to be left alone with my memories and my bees. Then the first notice appeared, tucked under the wiper blade of my car. It was printed on thick, cream-colored cardstock, the official letterhead of the Oakwood Estates HOA. The letter was a masterpiece of passive-aggressive nonsense. It spoke of community standards, the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood, and a bylaw that prohibited the harboring of nuisance animals or pests. At the bottom, in a scrawled, aggressive script, was the point: the beehives in your backyard are a violation of this code. You have 14 days to remove them. I read it 3 times. Nuisance animals. Pests. These were Eleanor's bees. They were the reason Brenda's own prize-winning roses were so vibrant every year. They were a cornerstone of the local ecosystem, not a violation of it. My initial reaction wasn't anger. It was a deep, weary sigh. I didn't have the energy for this fight. I did what any reasonable person would do. I looked up the local and state ordinances regarding apiaries. As I suspected, residential beekeeping was perfectly legal, encouraged even, as long as the hives were properly maintained and situated a certain distance from property lines. My setup exceeded every requirement. I typed up a polite, concise letter to the HOA board. I quoted the relevant state statutes, included a printout from the County Agricultural Extension Office, and gently explained that my bees were not, by any legal or practical definition, nuisance animals. I even threw in a little fact sheet about the benefits of local pollinators. I was trying to be helpful, to de-escalate. I was an engineer trying to solve a problem with logic and data. That was my first mistake. I was trying to reason with an unreasonable force. I was using physics to argue with a hurricane. Brenda's response came not in a letter, but in a full-scale assault of petty tyranny. A week later, I received a fine in the mail. $25. The reason? My lawn was 3/4 of an inch high in one particular spot near the driveway. The notice included a blurry photograph as evidence it looked like it was taken by someone belly-crawling through my yard at dawn. A few days after that, another fine. $50. The black paint on my mailbox was faded and, not in compliance with the approved color palette, it was the same mailbox that had been there for 15 years. Then she took it to the community Facebook page. Without using my name, she started posting long, rambling screeds about irresponsible neighbors who were endangering our children by keeping swarms of aggressive, stinging insects. She fabricated a story about a local toddler who was supposedly rushed to the emergency room after an attack. It was pure fiction, but it was enough to stir the pot. Section whispers started. Neighbors who used to wave would now just give a tight, nervous smile and hurry inside. I saw people pull their kids away from my side of the street when they were out for walks. I was being quietly, methodically ostracized. I tried to ignore it. I paid the stupid fines. I repainted the mailbox. I just wanted peace. I kept telling myself that if I just kept my head down, she'd eventually get bored and find a new target. That was my second mistake. Bullies don't get bored. They escalate. The turning point came on a Tuesday afternoon. I came home from work to find another notice taped to my front door. This one was different. It wasn't a fine. It was a threat. Final warning, it read in bold, angry letters. It claimed that since I had refused to comply with the order to remove the dangerous animals, the HOA was now invoking an emergency clause in the bylaws to abate the nuisance. It stated that if the hives were not gone within 48 hours, they would be professionally removed at my expense, and animal control would be notified. My blood ran cold. This wasn't about grass height or mailbox paint anymore. This was a direct threat to Eleanor's legacy. The image of some stranger in a hazmat suit callously destroying her hives, killing her bees, filled me with a cold, hard rage I hadn't felt in years. They were just a couple of wooden boxes filled with insects. But they were everything. They were my last promise to her. And this woman, this petty, power-mad tyrant in a golf cart, was going to take them away. That was the moment the peace-seeking man died. The engineer took over. Not the one who builds bridges, but the one who understands demolition. Brenda had pushed me too far. She had mistaken my grief for weakness. She had no idea who she was dealing with. She wasn't just fighting a quiet widower anymore. She was fighting a man who understood, better than anyone, that every structure has a breaking point. And I was going to find hers. The war was on. My first move wasn't aggressive. It was strategic. I pulled out my original copy of the Oakwood Estates HOA covenants and bylaws. It was a dense, 100-page document full of legalese and bureaucratic jargon. To most people, it was impenetrable. To me, it was a blueprint. I read it cover to cover that night, not like a homeowner, but like an engineer analyzing a schematic for a flawed design. I highlighted every ambiguity, every contradictory clause, every potential loophole. The next morning, I drove down to the county records office. I spent hours pulling public documents, the HOA's original incorporation papers, its annual financial statements, tax records, property deeds for all the common areas. I compiled a thick binder of information, cross-referencing everything. I was building a case, though I wasn't yet sure what I was looking for. I just knew that empires like Brenda's are always built on foundations of sand. I also paid a visit to my neighbor, Frank. Frank was a retired police detective who'd moved in a few years back. He was a quiet, observant man who spent most of his days tending his vegetable garden. We'd always been friendly, exchanging pleasantries over the fence. I had a feeling he'd seen his share of people like Brenda. I laid out the whole situation for him on his patio, showing him the stack of notices and fines. He listened patiently, nodding, his eyes sharp and analytical. "Classic bully," he said when I finished, taking a long sip of his iced tea. "Gets a little taste of power and it goes straight to her head. The problem is, you've been playing defense. You need to go on offense." "I don't want to stoop to her level, Frank," I said. "It's not about stooping," he corrected me. "It's about gathering rope. Give someone like her enough rope, and she'll hang herself. You need to document everything. Every interaction, every letter, every post online. And you need cameras." He pointed toward my house. "Get one for the front door, one covering your driveway, and one for the backyard. High definition, night vision, the works. If she's willing to make up stories for Facebook, there's no telling what she'll do in person. You need objective witnesses." His advice solidified my new approach. This wasn't going to be a shouting match at an HOA meeting. This was going to be a meticulous, evidence-based dismantling of her authority. That weekend, I installed a state-of-the-art security system. For discrete cameras that fed a continuous, time-stamped video stream to a secure hard drive in my office. The lens on the backyard camera had a perfect, unobstructed view of Eleanor's hives. While I was doing my research, I stumbled upon something interesting in the county's GIS database. It was a map of all the public utility and drainage easements in our neighborhood. An easement is a legal right for a utility or government agency to use a specific part of someone's property for a specific purpose. You can't build permanent structures on them. I noticed a very large, very important drainage easement that ran right through the middle of the Oakwood Estates community garden. This garden was Brenda's pride and joy. It was the centerpiece of her reign, a project she had championed and for which she had secured a massive annual budget from the HOA. She won awards for it. She was featured in the local paper, standing proudly amongst her prize-winning tomatoes and zinnias. According to the county map, her beautifully constructed raised beds, her expensive irrigation system, and a ridiculously ornate gazebo were all sitting squarely on top of a primary storm drain for the entire subdivision. This was more than a minor infraction, it was a serious violation that could have massive implications for the neighborhood's flood control. Then I looked at the HOA's financial reports. The line items for the garden were astronomical. Premium organic soil, specialty fertilizers, custom landscaping services, the costs were outrageous, far beyond what a simple community garden should require. And all the invoices were from one company, Brenda's Beautiful Scapes, LLC. She was contracting with herself. It might not have been illegal if it was disclosed and approved by the board, but it stank to high heaven. The sheer amount of money being funneled into that garden was a massive red flag. It was a weakness. A potential fracture point in her foundation. Now I had a direction. My engineering brain kicked into high gear. The problem was no longer just save the bees, the project was now expose the fraud, the bees were just the catalyst. My plan started to form, a multi-phase operation. Phase 1 was what I called strategic compliance. I had to address her 48-hour ultimatum, but I was going to do it on my own terms. I called a friend, another amateur beekeeper who lived about 5 miles away, well outside the jurisdiction of Oakwood Estates. I asked if he could temporarily host my hives. He agreed immediately. The next Saturday, I made a very public show of moving the bees. I waited until mid-morning, when I knew Brenda would be out on her golf cart patrol. I suited up in my full beekeeping gear and, with my friend's help, carefully loaded the 2 hives onto my truck. Brenda drove by slowly, a triumphant smirk plastered on her face. She gave me a little wave, the kind a queen gives to a vanquished peasant. She thought she had won. She had no idea she had just personally triggered the first stage of her own demise. What Brenda didn't know, but what I, the engineer and amateur apiarist, knew very well, was that honeybees have a foraging range of about 2 to 3 miles. My bees were the primary pollinators for a huge swath of our neighborhood. That included the award-winning Oakwood Estates community garden. I had just removed the entire workforce that kept her little empire blooming. I didn't need to do anything else. I just had to wait for nature to take its course. It was the most elegant, poetic form of sabotage I could imagine. I was weaponizing botany. With the bees gone, the immediate threat was neutralized. Now I could focus on phase 2, observation and incrimination. My cameras were running 24/7. My binder of evidence was growing. I started attending every single HOA meeting, sitting silently in the back, taking notes. My presence alone unnerved her. She would stumble over her words whenever she glanced in my direction. The first few weeks were quiet. Brenda was basking in her victory. She even made a smug post on the Facebook page about how the pest problem had been resolved through decisive community action. But then, things started to change. It was subtle at first. I'd walk past the community garden and notice that the squash blossoms were dropping off the vines without setting fruit. The tomato plants were lush and green, but they weren't producing many tomatoes. The vibrant beds of zinnias and cosmos looked tired. I knew why. Without my bees, the local pollinator population had plummeted. The few native bees and butterflies couldn't handle the workload of such a large, concentrated garden. The entire ecosystem was out of balance. Brenda started to panic. I could see it in the way she fussed over the plants, spending hours in the garden every day. The budget for specialty fertilizers suddenly doubled. She was trying to fix a pollination problem with chemicals. It was like trying to fix a cracked foundation with a new coat of paint. Her frustration grew, and it started to focus back on me. She was convinced I was somehow responsible. In her mind, I must have done something, cursed the soil, perhaps. She couldn't grasp that the solution had been buzzing in my backyard the whole time, and she had driven it away. One night, my plan paid its first major dividend. It was just after 2 a.m. I was woken up by a notification on my phone from the security system. Motion detected at property line. I pulled up the live feed on my tablet. There, cloaked in the grainy black and white of the infrared camera, was a figure. It was Brenda. She was creeping along the edge of my property, carrying a sprayer canister. I watched, my heart pounding, as she systematically began spraying something all over the grass along our shared property line. She was moving furtively, casting nervous glances over her shoulder. She thought I was hiding the bees somewhere on my property. She must have assumed I had a secret hive, and she was trying to poison them with a herbicide or pesticide. She was trespassing and actively attempting to damage my property, all captured in crystal clear 1080p. I saved the footage to 3 separate locations before I even went back to bed. The rope I was giving her was tightening into a noose. The next HOA meeting was 2 weeks later. It was the usual affair, tedious debates about holiday decorations and complaints about parking. Brenda was noticeably on edge. The community garden was now a topic of concern among the residents. It was visibly failing, and people were starting to ask questions about the money being spent on it. When the floor was opened for new business, I stood up. It was the first time I had spoken at a meeting in over a year. The room went quiet. I have a question about the community garden budget, I said, my voice steady. Brenda stiffened. The budget is approved and transparent. Do you have a specific concern, she asked, her tone dripping with disdain. I do, I said. Given the significant expenditures on soil and fertilizer, the lack of productivity is puzzling. I was wondering if the board had considered any other environmental factors that might be at play. She scoffed. We use only the best products from the most reputable suppliers. The garden is managed by an expert, meaning herself. An expert, of course, I said. Perhaps the expert has a theory, then. Because from my perspective, it looks like a classic case of pollination failure. But that can't be it, can it? Since we've already established that bees are a nuisance not welcome in Oakwood Estates. A murmur went through the crowd. I had connected the two issues. Her victory over me was now visibly linked to the failure of her pet project. She saw where I was going and tried to shut me down. This is not the forum for your petty grievances about the bees. If you have a legitimate issue. Oh, this is more than a petty grievance, I interrupted, pulling a small projector out of my laptop bag. This is about community standards. About protecting our property. For instance, what is the HOA's policy on a board member trespassing and attempting to poison a resident's lawn in the middle of the night? Before she could respond, I had the projector aimed at the blank wall behind her. I clicked a button on my laptop. The video started to play. The room was silent, save for the hum of the projector. The grainy, infrared image of Brenda, creeping around my yard with her poison sprayer, filled the wall. Her face, illuminated by a neighbor's security light, was unmistakable. The gasp from the audience was collective and sharp. Brenda stared at the screen, her face turning from pale white to a blotchy, furious red. That's fake," she stammered. "It's doctored. He's been stalking me. This is harassment." But the evidence was right there, playing on a loop for everyone to see. Her perfect, manicured image was cracking right before their eyes. She started screaming, calling me a liar, a pervert, threatening to sue me, the HOA, everyone in the room. It was a full-scale meltdown. She had lost control of the narrative, and more importantly, she had lost control of herself. Her social credibility, the foundation of her power, had just been dynamited. She wasn't an esteemed community leader anymore. She was just a crazy lady on a wall, poisoning a lawn in the dead of night. I didn't say another word. I just packed up my projector and sat down. The trap had been sprung. And she had flown right into it. Brenda's public meltdown was a tactical victory, but I knew it wasn't the end of the war. A cornered animal is the most dangerous. I had exposed her, humiliated her, and she was not the type to let that go. I braced myself for the retaliation. It came faster and harder than I could have imagined. She went scorched earth. The very next day, 2 police officers showed up at my door. They were polite but firm. A complaint had been filed against me for harassment and stalking. Brenda had twisted the story, claiming my security cameras were aimed at her house, that I was spying on her, that she was living in fear. I calmly invited them in and showed them the full, unedited video footage. I showed them the camera placements, demonstrating that they only covered my own property. I showed them the long history of her unwarranted fines and threatening notices. To their credit, the officers were professional. They could see through her lies almost immediately. They took a copy of the video as evidence for a potential property damage claim on my part and left with a quiet apology for bothering me. But Brenda was just getting started. She launched a vicious smear campaign. Using anonymous accounts, she flooded the community Facebook page with insane accusations. She claimed I was a dangerous recluse. She hinted that I had a problem with women. In one particularly vile post, she suggested that a man who lived alone and kept strange things in his backyard couldn't be trusted around children. It was a clear, disgusting attempt to paint me as a predator. The accusations were so outlandish that most people dismissed them, but the mud she was slinging was thick and sticky. It was designed to isolate me completely. Then she attacked my livelihood. She found out where I worked. It wasn't hard. My firm's name was on a small sign in my front yard from a charity fund-run sponsorship. She called my boss. She called our firm's HR department. She sent a long, rambling email to the company's general counsel. She accused me of unstable behavior, of being a community menace, and claimed my actions were a disgrace to the company's reputation. My boss, a good man named David who I'd worked with for 20 years, called me into his office. He looked more tired than angry. "Mark, I know this is all garbage," he said, gesturing to the printed-out email on his desk. "But you know how this works. Corporate gets nervous. Legal has to do their due diligence. They've opened an internal review." My stomach dropped. An internal review. Even if I was cleared, it was a black mark, a permanent stain on my professional record. She was trying to ruin me, to burn down every part of my life. This was no longer about bees or gardens or HOA rules. This was about survival. Her desperation was a signal. It told me I was close, that the fraud I suspected was real and that she was terrified of it being exposed. I had to find the final piece of the puzzle, the one undeniable proof that would end this for good. That proof came from the most unexpected source. One evening, I got an email from a generic, anonymous address. The subject line was just, "Oakwood Estates Garden." "I think I can help you," the message read. "I used to be in business with Brenda. She cheated me, and I know what she's been doing with the HOA's money. Meet me tomorrow. 10 p.m. The diner on the highway." It could have been a trap. But my gut, the same instinct that tells an engineer when a design is fundamentally unstable, told me it was real. I agreed to the meeting. The man who slid into the booth opposite me was named Arthur. He was haggard and nervous, constantly glancing at the door. He told me a story that made my blood boil. He and Brenda had run a small landscaping business together years ago. Brenda handled the books. He handled the labor. Eventually, she pushed him out, accusing him of theft and dissolving the partnership, keeping the clients and equipment for herself. She was always a cheat, he said, his hands trembling as he stirred his coffee. But what she's doing now, it's on another level. He explained the scam. Brenda's Beautiful Scapes, LLC, was a shell. She had no employees, no equipment. She was a middleman. She would win the HOA contract, then subcontract the actual work to other companies for a fraction of the price and pocket the difference. That was bad enough. But the soil scam was the real crime. She's not buying premium organic compost, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a whisper. She has a contact at an industrial site on the other side of the county. They have to pay to dispose of their fill dirt. It's runoff soil, contaminated with whatever they're using over there. They give it to her for free, just to haul it away. She prints up fake invoices from a defunct supplier in another state and bills the HOA for tens of thousands of dollars. It's pure profit. My mind was racing. Contaminated fill. On a public drainage easement. As a hydrologist, I knew exactly what that meant. Every time it rained, whatever toxins were in that dirt, heavy metals, industrial solvents, God knows what else, were leaching directly into the storm drain. A storm drain that fed into the local creek, which in turn fed into the reservoir that supplied our town's drinking water. This wasn't just fraud anymore. This was a potential environmental disaster. Arthur slid a manila envelope across the table. These are copies of the real contracts she had with the subcontractors. Compare them to the invoices she submitted to the HOA. And this, he said, tapping the envelope, is the address of the industrial site she gets the dirt from. Good luck. He stood up and walked out without another word, leaving me with the smoking gun. I now had everything I needed. The whistleblower's testimony and documents. My video evidence of her criminal activity. My professional expertise to understand and explain the environmental danger. I wasn't just fighting for Eleanor's bees anymore. I was fighting for the health and safety of my entire community. The next morning, I didn't call the local police. I didn't call the HOA. I put on my best suit, organized all my evidence into a neat, professional binder, and prepared a detailed engineering report, complete with soil percolation models and runoff projections. My first call was to the state's Environmental Protection Agency. I explained the situation calmly and factually, as if I were presenting a project proposal. I emailed them my report. They were interested. Very interested. My second call was to the district attorney's office, specifically their white-collar crime division. I explained the evidence of wire fraud and embezzlement, backed up by Arthur's documents. They were also very interested. I had bypassed the playground monitor and gone straight to the Supreme Court. Brenda was operating in a world of petty fines and Facebook drama. I was about to introduce her to the world of felony indictments and federal regulations. The wheels of justice turn slowly, but when you give them a well-engineered push, they can gain momentum with terrifying speed. The EPA moved first. Unmarked vans with government plates appeared at the community garden a week later. Men and women in official jackets took soil samples, drilled core samples, and surveyed the entire area. The garden was cordoned off with yellow tape, declaring it a site under environmental review. Brenda was apoplectic. She was seen screaming at the EPA officials, threatening to have them arrested for trespassing. They calmly showed her a warrant, and she was forced to retreat, her face a mask of impotent fury. The community was buzzing with rumors. The foundation of her little kingdom was not just cracked, it was being excavated by federal agents. A few weeks after that, the district attorney's office made its move. They didn't just arrest her. That would have been too simple. They wanted to make an example of her. They worked with the non-Brenda-aligned members of the HOA board to call a special, emergency community meeting. The official reason was to present the findings of a mandatory financial audit. Everyone was required to attend. It was held in the high school auditorium to accommodate the crowd. The air was thick with tension and speculation. Brenda was there, sitting at the head table with the rest of the board, trying to project an aura of calm authority, but her eyes darted around the room like a trapped bird. The meeting was called to order. An unassuming man in a gray suit, an investigator from the DA's office, was introduced as the independent auditor. He began by putting up a slide showing the garden's budget over the last 5 years. The numbers were staggering. Then, he looked out at the audience. "We've invited a resident to help us understand some of these discrepancies," he said. "Mark, would you please come up?" I walked to the podium. I felt 100 pairs of eyes on me. I looked over at Brenda. If looks could kill, I would have been a pile of ash on the stage. I ignored her and addressed the crowd. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't use inflammatory language. I laid out the facts with the cold, dispassionate precision of an engineering report. For the past 5 years, I began, our community has been paying for premium organic topsoil for the community garden. According to the invoices submitted by Brenda's Beautiful Scapes, we have purchased over 400 cubic yards of it, at a cost of over $80,000. I clicked to the next slide. It showed one of Brenda's invoices, with its exorbitant price, next to the real contract from Arthur's envelope, showing a subcontractor being paid a pittance for labor. This is what we were billed for. And this is what was actually paid out. The difference, approximately $65,000, was funneled directly to an LLC owned and operated by the HOA president. Gasps echoed through the auditorium. Brenda jumped to her feet. Lies. These are forged documents. He is a disgruntled resident with a vendetta. The investigator from the DA's office held up a hand. "Please let him finish, ma'am. You'll have a chance to respond." I continued, my voice never wavering. The greater issue is not the financial fraud. The greater issue is what we actually received for our money. My next slide was a preliminary report from the EPA. A list of chemical compounds. Lead. Arsenic. Petroleum byproducts. The soil in our award-winning garden is, in fact, contaminated industrial fill. It is classified as hazardous material. For 5 years, our children have been playing near it. We have been eating vegetables grown in it. A wave of horror and disgust swept through the room. People were looking at their hands, at their children. The scope of her betrayal was sinking in. Furthermore, I went on, my engineering knowledge now becoming the final nail in her coffin, this hazardous material was placed directly on top of a primary storm drainage easement. I have created a hydrological model to show what happens when it rains. The next slide was an animated map of the neighborhood. I showed how rainwater leached through the contaminated soil, entered the storm drain, and flowed directly into the town's water supply. Every rainfall has been a small-scale environmental poisoning event, courtesy of the HOA's leadership. I had one last piece of evidence. I turned to Brenda. Of course, when I first started looking into these matters, our HOA president became concerned. So concerned that she took matters into her own hands. I played the video. On the giant auditorium screen, the footage of her poisoning my lawn was now cinemasized. Her furtive, criminal actions were broadcast for the entire community to see in stark detail. That was it. The dam broke. Brenda completely lost control. It was a full-blown public meltdown, a supernova of narcissistic rage. She started screaming, a long, incoherent tirade of accusations and denials. She blamed me. She blamed Arthur. She blamed the board members for not supporting her. She blamed the residents for being ungrateful. In her panic, she started confessing. "I did it for you," she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at the crowd. "To make this neighborhood beautiful. So what if I had to cut a few corners? You all loved the garden. You all loved the awards." It was a full admission, right there in front of a dozen witnesses and a man from the district attorney's office. As she was ranting, 2 plainclothes detectives, who had been sitting quietly in the front row, stood up and walked calmly toward the stage. They flanked her at the podium. "Brenda," one of them said, his voice quiet but firm. "You are under arrest for multiple counts of wire fraud, embezzlement, and reckless endangerment." The reality of the situation finally hit her. Her face went slack with shock. The fight drained out of her, replaced by a look of pure, pathetic terror. They put her hands behind her back and the click of the handcuffs echoed through the silent auditorium. As they were leading her away, she turned and locked eyes with me. Her face was a twisted mask of hatred. "You'll regret this," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "You'll pay." It was the last, hollow threat from a queen with no kingdom, a general with no army. It was just noise. I didn't even flinch. I just stood there and watched as the woman who tried to destroy my last connection to my wife was led away in disgrace, her reign of terror finally, and completely, over. The aftermath was chaos, but it was a cleansing chaos. The community was in shock, but also strangely liberated. It was as if a dark cloud that had been hanging over Oakwood Estates for years had finally dissipated. The HOA was effectively dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up. An interim board was appointed, with Frank, my retired detective neighbor, reluctantly accepting the role of president. The first order of business was transparency. Every financial record was made public. Every contract was put up for open bid. The reign of secrets and intimidation was over. The community garden was declared a state-level biohazard site. A professional remediation company was brought in, and the entire area was excavated, the contaminated soil carted away in sealed trucks. The cost was enormous, but most of it was covered by the funds the DA's office seized from Brenda's personal and business accounts. She had amassed a small fortune from her scam. Brenda's fate was a study in poetic justice. She faced a mountain of state and federal charges. The wire fraud and embezzlement were bad enough, but the environmental crimes were what truly buried her. She was portrayed in the media as a monster in pearls, a suburban mom who knowingly poisoned her own neighbors to fund her lavish lifestyle. She lost everything. Her house was sold to pay for the massive fines and restitution. Her husband, who claimed to have known nothing, divorced her. Her social standing evaporated. In the end, she took a plea deal and was sentenced to 7 years in a federal prison. 7 years. For a war that started over a couple of beehives. The internal review at my job was quietly closed. In fact, I became something of a local hero. The story was picked up by the regional news. The engineer who fought the HOA and uncovered an environmental crisis, my boss gave me a promotion, citing my tenacity and commitment to ethical standards. It seemed my little war had inadvertently become the best performance review of my career. A few months after everything settled down, I drove out to my friend's property. The sun was warm, and the air was sweet with the smell of clover. We suited up and carefully loaded Eleanor's hives back onto my truck. When I brought them home, back to their rightful place in my garden, it felt like I was bringing a part of her back with me. I set them up in the exact same spot they had been before. Within an hour, the bees were out, reorienting themselves, already exploring the familiar territory of the neighborhood's flower beds. My neighbors, who had once shunned me, now treated me with a new respect. They would stop by to thank me. Some brought gifts, a pie, a bottle of wine. Mrs. Gable from 3 doors down, who had been one of Brenda's most vocal supporters, came to my door with tears in her eyes and apologized. She told me her grandson used to love playing in the community garden. The thought of what could have happened left her shaken. The neighborhood began to heal. A new, smaller, truly organic community garden was planted in a different, safer location. People talked to each other more. There was a sense of shared purpose, of having survived something together. Sometimes, I sit in my backyard on a summer evening, a glass of iced tea in my hand, and just listen. I listen to the gentle, productive hum of the bees. It's the sound of life. The sound of resilience. The sound of peace. I never wanted a fight. I just wanted to be left alone to grieve and to tend to my wife's legacy. But Brenda, in her arrogance and greed, forced my hand. She tried to take the one thing that brought me comfort, and in doing so, she brought her whole corrupt world crashing down on her head. I learned something through all of this. I learned that my engineering mind, the part of me that deals in stress points and load-bearing capacities, could be applied to more than just concrete and steel. Justice, it turns out, is also a matter of structural integrity. You just have to find the cracks in the foundation, apply the right amount of pressure, and wait for the whole rotten structure to collapse under its own weight. The bees are thriving now. The honey they produced this year was the best I've ever tasted. It's light and sweet, with a hint of the wildflowers that now grow freely in the neighborhood. Every time I taste it, I think of Eleanor. I think she would be proud. Not just of the honey, but of the fact that I stood up for her bees, and in the end, for our whole community. The peace I have now is a peace I had to fight for. And that makes it all the sweeter.